we're going to continue to look at the French Revolution today. This is part 2, where we get into a little more of the violent stuff, starting with Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, ending with Napoleon. Basically, during this part of the revolution, everybody dies, and nothing gets resolved. So we first need to look back at the revolution, and at the beginnings of the revolution, after the Tennis Court Oath and the National Assembly has called for a new constitution, and a constitutional monarchy is in place. We should look at the reactions to this, to the beginnings of the revolution. And what you have at first is an initial defense of the revolution by the intellectual community throughout Europe. Two women in particular, Wollstonecraft and Gouge, are very supportive of the revolution, and that's in part because of what we talked about in the last video with the increasing rights for women. But you also have a number of other intellectuals who are applauding these ideals of natural rights and separation of powers that have been implemented during the French Revolution. So overall, there's this idea that, yeah, we've done a good thing. We've gotten rid of an alleged absolute monarch and replaced it with a constitutional monarch. So this is a very good step in the right direction. And initially, other countries and other kings approve of this as well, because they see France as their enemy. They traditionally have. And anytime they see a weakened enemy, they celebrate. They're no longer posing as large of a threat to them. Now, it takes a while, but eventually these kings realize, wait a minute, if they're toppling that king, they may eventually want to topple me. And so slowly, these kings and queens end up becoming enemies of the revolution, but initially they're like, yeah, go for it, get rid of Louis, make him weaker, make him struggle domestically. That way, internationally, we can expand our empire, or we can get better trade deals, or whatever it may be, while weakening France. So you kind of have this initial, like, all right, this constitutional monarch's a good thing, but not everybody is happy with it. And the big group in France that is not are the Jacobins, and they are radical revolutionaries. And they see the nobility and kings as being a problem not just in France but throughout Europe. And their goal is to have a European-wide revolt and to get rid of the old establishment and replace it with republicanism. Their version of republicanism and representative democracy. And so the Jacobins become this radicalized element who say this revolution has not gone far enough. And very quickly, they end up gaining the power because things don't turn around overnight in France. Those problems we talk about with poverty and lack of food and lack of money, those aren't fixed immediately. And so as things aren't happening, people are demanding action. Why isn't it done? Why isn't it done? And so eventually they turn to the Jacobins, a more radical element who's pushing for these promises of change. And so one of the major things they push for is war against Europe. They think that war is going to help. This war will help them succeed. And part of it's economic, that as these armies are out conquering, they're collecting food and money from these other countries. Now that's predicated on the idea that you win the war, which France has kind of struggled with around this time period. And the other nice thing about war is it employs a large number of people in your population. So war is good in that regard. So the Jacobins push for war against Europe. And so initially France is against war against what's known as the First Coalition. And that is basically just Prussia and Austria and what is called the Austrian Netherlands, which is a kind of an extension of Austria, although not directly connected. So France is fighting this war against these powers, and initially they just fail. Their army is miserable, they're outgunned, they're outmaneuvered, and they lose these battles pretty handily at the beginning. And so people look for a scapegoat. They look to blame somebody, and naturally this blame goes against the king and the queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who these people just hate. Absolutely hate. And so they believe that the king and queen are working against the revolution in order to undercut these military endeavors and cause them to lose. And so what happens is this era known as, quote, the Second Revolution, whereby the monarchy disappears. Because of this failure of the French army, people blame the monarchs, and so they remove the monarchs from power. And this also is in part because there's this time where Louis tries to escape with his family, or at least his wife and son. He leaves his daughter behind. And as he's nearing the border, about to make his escape, he stops because he has to use the restroom, and he is very quickly found out and returned to Paris. So people think that they have betrayed him, and he's just running away, and it's just all terrible. And so what follows is an event known as the September Massacres, where people get all riled up and think that the monarchy is after them. And so they want to go, they're out for blood. They have bloodlust, and they're out to kill everybody. So they storm the prisons of Paris. And in what's known as the September Massacre, they end up killing thousands of people. Ostensibly, these are the nobility, but the reality is that most of the prisoners came from the Third Estate. And so you have this bloodlust that when it can't be turned on the king and queen, gets turned on the prisoners. Now, of course, eventually the king and queen have their heads cut off, but the common prisoners will have to make do for now. Around this time, the National Convention is formed, replacing the National Assembly, and they are elected and declare France a republic, where they are no longer a constitutional monarchy. We have gotten rid of the king and queen, and now we have the National Convention to lead as a republic. And within Republican France, you have all these major changes that take place. They have a new calendar system because they don't like the old system that is predicated on religion. And so they replace it with calendars that are named after the seasons. So you'll get to these weird things. And they start from year 0, where the French Revolution begins and the calendar begins anew. So you'll see later there will be actions in the month of Thermidor during year 2. Which doesn't make any sense to us and fits in this revolutionary mindset of leaving the old system behind. They wanted to rid France of any ties to the nobility, to the church, and to the old system of the king and queen. So you have these new calendars. You also have new festivals that take place. Saints' days are eliminated, and they're replaced with festivals honoring the country of France and the people of France. And they get rid of the hours. So no longer are hours made up of 60 minutes, and there's not 24 hours in a day. There's 10 hours in a day that are 100 minutes. And I think the length of minute may change. My math is not exactly perfect here. But they just kind of revoke everything because they want this idea of a fresh start, this new break. The revolution represents a new start in France. And so in this national convention, you have a division. You have two kind of separate groups that are vying for power. The first is the Girondists, and they're this French group from the south of France. And the other is this group known as the Mountain, which is a really bizarre name. But these are the two factions that have this power in this national convention, and they kind of constantly are butting heads against each other for various reasons. And it is this national convention that accuses Louis XVI of treason and eventually sentences him to death. He is sentenced to death by one vote. If one guy had swung his vote the other way, Louis would not have had his head chopped off, and Marie Antoinette probably would not either. But that's not the way that the head falls, and in fact, Louis has his removed. And the National Convention kind of builds on this patriotic fervor. And so they expand this war as everyone in Europe is the enemy of France. And that's because everyone in Europe has a monarchy. And these radical, the National Convention essentially is made up of members from the Jacobins. So the Jacobins split into the Girondist and the Mountain, and there's a few other groups. But all of these elements are radical Republicans who don't want kings and queens and nobles. They want to get rid of the old system. And so they're going to war with anybody who has any legacy of that. So in addition to being at war with Austria and Prussia, France declares war on Britain, Holland, which is the Netherlands, and Spain. Now they're at war with 5 separate countries, all of them incredibly powerful, and they're fighting this war by themselves. Meanwhile, there's tension and turmoil within France because there's still not economic equality. And a large group that rises up against that to push for this economic equality is known as the sans-culottes, those with the knee breeches and without knee breeches. And so they're wearing this different style. They're wearing long trousers instead of knickers. And this designates them as the sans-culottes, who are pushing for change because they're not seeing the economic reform they were promised when this whole revolution started. And so they're disenchanted, and not just with the monarchy and with the nobles, but also now with the National Convention and others. And people see this and they prey on this fear and this weakness. And the person who does that is Maximilien Robespierre, who leads this group called the Mountain. And what the Mountain does is they see this sans-culottes group as being the voice of the people. And they realize that they can now exploit these people and exploit their needs and turn them against their political enemy, the Girondists. And so what they do is they have the Girondists accused of treason, and 31 of them are arrested, which cripples this political party. It allows Robespierre and this group, the Mountain, to gain power. And they really have formed, and they had already formed this Committee of Public Safety, but they form it even larger and make it no longer just a subcommittee of the National Convention, but the committee that runs this country. And of course, the head of that committee is Maximilien Robespierre. And we'll see that this Committee of Public Safety is just awful. In addition to this, they set up what they call a planned economy. And this planned economy is kind of as it sounds, where the government plans what the economy is going to look like. So specifically what they do in Republican France is they set maximum prices for key goods and products. Mostly that is bread. They say, hey, bread can never cost more than $2 a loaf. And this is to appease the people who had been frustrated. Now this artificially forces prices down, which is economically not the best idea, but politically it gains lots of support. And those who are found not following these guidelines are arrested and charged with treason as enemy of the state. And they very quickly find their heads being removed from their bodies via the guillotine. So in addition to setting these maximum prices for goods, mostly bread, they also tell craftsmen and this proto-industrialization what they can make. So they basically tell people, hey, look, we're going to be done with making luxuries. We've got to focus on making war material. And that's because they are in this massive war with 5 other major countries. So there's no more time to make fancy stuff. We got to make guns, we got to make bullets, we got to make horseshoes, we got to make swords, we got to make anything we can in order to succeed in this war. So the government in a planned economy takes some measure of control over the means of production and then the pricing. So again, in France at this time, it is pricing mostly for bread and then the kind of stopping of luxury goods and rather the creation of war materials. This Committee of Public Safety not only is concerned economically, but also has political and social needs as well. And they need to keep the population in check. So yes, giving them bread makes them happy, but they look to create an other. All totalitarian dictatorial regimes do this. They create an us versus them. And what they do is they create these this abstract concept of enemies of the nation, enemies of France, people who are trying to undercut this revolution, who are trying to work against it. And most of those people, well, theoretically, most of those people are the former nobility and clergy. But the reality is this reign of terror ends up affecting the Third Estate just as well. And during this time, you have 40,000 people executed. And people are just lining up and getting their heads chopped off at the guillotine, one after another, after another, after another. And then the people, this is where the emphasis of terror comes in. They take the heads of the noblemen, stick them on pikes, and parade them through the street, singing patriotic songs about how they're defending liberty and equality. And those songs eventually become the French national anthem. So you have this really nasty time during this reign of terror. And they really promote this sense of nationalism and national sentiment to build this revolution. That people who are selling grain prices for too high are enemies of the nation. People who are former nobles who are trying to maintain a hold on their land and their property, they're not just trying to protect their property, they're enemies of the nation. And as such, they must be killed because you cannot have that cancer infecting your society. And so for a while, this continues. Now, the problem is that people kind of get sick of bloodshed after a while. Especially when the targets just become rampant. And you just fear waking up and being accused of being an enemy of the nation. Whether that's by your neighbor, by some newspaperman, or just arrested by a soldier on the street. So, eventually, people get sick of Robespierre. And they overthrow him. And this is called the Thermidorian reaction. And that's because it happens during that newly created month called Thermidor. Which we know as July. But during this time, Robespierre is brought down. He gets up to make a speech and he is booed off the stage after this little coup is run. He is arrested, charged with treason. He tries to kill himself and fails, and so faces his guillotine himself. And his head is eventually cut off. Now, this leads to full chaos. because now there was tons of bloodshed, but the guy who was at least keeping some semblance of order is dead. No one really knows up from down. There's all these wars going on and people are dying, rumors spreading, peasants and outlaws ravaging the countryside, killing everybody, nobles wondering if they're allowed to have power or not. Those who were previously suppressed due to Robespierre and this Committee of Public Safety are unsure if they can voice their opinions now. And eventually what happens is there's this recognition that this National Convention is too divisive. And what happens is it is replaced by a 5-member committee known as the Directory. Now the Republican ideals remain where these people are voted in. But instead of having however many hundreds of representatives at the National Convention, you now have 5. It creates an oligarchy that allows for more efficient running of the government, at least theoretically. And it is into this power vacuum where people are concerned and chaos happens that steps in one of the most famous men in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon seizes control of the Directory and declares himself the first consul. He is one of 5. But he says, look, I am the first consul because of what is going on here. This is not going to work. There needs to be some semblance of control, and I will be the one who leads it. Once he has seized power, he decides that he wants to make this seem somewhat legitimate. So he organizes a vote known as a plebiscite. And he's hearkening back to Roman times, where you had these consuls, and they were elected by the plebes, that is everybody else. And so he uses that same language, where he's consul. He's not emperor yet. He is the consul, and he has a plebiscite, a vote of the people to decide if he should continue being consul. He's eventually elected consul for life, and then takes on the term emperor. And during his time, he enacts this really impressive reform within domestic policy. So he invokes something called the Civil Code of 1804, which we know as the Napoleonic Code. It's this new set of laws codified throughout France. It's their new legal system. He creates a national bank in order to prevent any financial disasters like what befell Louis XIV, XV, and XVI. He strengthens the French bureaucracy and expands it and creates this bureaucratic organization that is efficient and a government that can lead, can manage, and can really be an effective tool to control not only the French population, but control French interests overseas. He grants pardons to all groups. He welcomes the nobles back because he knows that they have money and they have traditional power, and he knows that he can use them. He also grants some pardons to the clergy and to the nobility and some of the crazier people. He plays these social groups off against each other. He is a brilliant man and a brilliant leader. And he plays the church against itself by signing the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope. And in this, he's like, look, Pope, we're sorry about that whole nationalizing of the church thing. That was a bad idea. So we'll grant you some concessions. We'll give you some of your land back. Oh, but by the way, the French government gets to appoint all bishops and priests. And so by doing this, he's really keeping the power out of the hands of the clergy and keeping the power in the hands of the French government. However, one negative during this time is women lose the rights that they had gained during the French Republic. They essentially become subservient to their husbands and their fathers. They lose the right to inherit land and open bank accounts and do anything of that sort. And they're stuck being subservient. And they push this idea, Napoleon and his government, of the family monarchy, where the husband is the monarch of the house. He is the absolute ruler, and everything he says go, and everyone is subservient to him. Meanwhile, Napoleon has his foreign policy, which we are all significantly more familiar with. He's continuously expanding the empire. France becomes an empire at this point. And his goal, he's kind of expanding along the European continent. He's defeated most of the European nations, and he sets his eyes on Britain. He wants to avenge the 3 losses that the French had suffered to Great Britain, and so he decides to set up for an invasion. However, in order to invade Britain, he needs to cross the English Channel, so he must first bring his fleet that is in the Mediterranean up to the English Channel. He must pass through the narrow Gibraltar Strait between Spain and Morocco, and it is there that his navy meets Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, where the British destroy the French Navy and stop any thoughts of an invasion of Great Britain. And in this time, there is another coalition that's formed to fight France, and that is Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Britain, known as the Third Coalition. And they all fight together against France. However, at the Battle of Austerlitz, it's one of Napoleon's greatest victories. He defeats the Third Coalition. He gains control over the German Confederation and Austria, and he manipulates the German states to his liking. You recall that there was a time when there was like 360 different princes. He manipulates them. He gets rid of some principalities. He merges others, and he places other people in various kingdoms in order to manipulate it to his will. And in this time, by the end of this defeat of the Third Coalition, the only nations of Europe that stand against him, well, the only nation that stands against him is Great Britain, and the only other ones that he does not control are Portugal and the Ottoman Empire. And so Napoleon has created this grand empire, which consists of three parts. First, that he rules directly, which is France, Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of northern Italy, and parts of modern-day Germany. This massive French Gaelic area that he controls by himself. In addition, he has set up dependent satellite kingdoms where he's put his family members as kings in order to rule, and his cousin is subservient to him. And these are in some of the smaller kingdoms that he has conquered. Italy, Naples, Bavaria, Switzerland, the other German states. And then he signs treaties with other independent states like Austria and Prussia and Russia and forces them to obey his will. Because if they resist, he will bring this grand empire down on them and crush them. Now, Napoleon's egotistical. He's a megalomaniac, and things fall apart for him. And part of that is a result of this Continental System. And the Continental System is Napoleon's way of trying to break the back of Britain. He says, look, fine, Britain I can't invade, but I can destroy them economically, so no one's allowed to trade with them. No one on the continent can trade with Great Britain. There are no British goods allowed here. Nothing's allowed to go to Britain. He forces all of his allies to follow this as well. This backfires significantly because Great Britain at this time has a massive global empire. Anything they need, they can get from their colonies. And what happens is that these members of the Continental System now have to run the British ships, the British blockade, and they're struggling to get things out to their colonies. Their economies stagnate. They're not getting all these new goods and new technologies. And so although this is meant as an attack on Great Britain, it actually fails, and it ends up backfiring. And the result is that some nations kind of are upset about this, and they grumble, and eventually Russia ignores this Continental System and says, you know what, we got to trade with Britain. They have things we need. And this drives Napoleon insane. And that eventually leads to his downfall. So the reason why Napoleon and Imperial France collapses, it starts with revolts, mainly in Spain. There's resistance to this French influence. They don't want it. They want to rule themselves. They want self-determination. They don't want to be allied and subservient and obeying Napoleon at all times. The failure of the Continental System, where these the economies of the continent collapse, while the British economy grows rapidly, in part due to industrialization, which we'll look at next chapter. And then Napoleon makes his greatest blunder. He invades Russia. And he invades in the winter. And he invades with 600,000 soldiers. And he returns with 30,000. An absolutely phenomenal attrition rate. 5% of the people who go survive. The rest are dead or captured. This crushes Napoleon's empire. And so, because of the loss of this army, and most of those people were not French, by the way, they were from these satellite states and these dependent kingdoms, but regardless, it crushes the will of the people. And so you see Austria, Prussia, and Russia rise up against Napoleon. They join Great Britain, and they form this fourth coalition, and they end up defeating Napoleon and forcing him into exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. And they do that because they can't execute him, because that would set a bad precedent in case they lost a war and they got their heads cut off. They don't like that. So they just send him to exile, and in this time they restore the grandson of Louis XVI, or maybe it's his uncle or nephew, Louis XVIII, to the throne. But Louis XVIII sucks. He is not a good king, and no one likes him, and there are problems in France. So Napoleon buys his way off Elba by bribing people, marches with his loyal followers into Paris, and says, I am here to save France. He quickly raises an army and leads it against his former enemies. He reaches Waterloo, where he is destroyed by that fourth coalition, and the army collapses. Napoleon returns to France in disgrace, and there he is sent to exile on the island of St. Helena off the coast, kind of right in between South America and Africa, where he lives out the rest of his days. And this time period when Napoleon's back is known as the 100 Days because he only rules for 100 days. And eventually the Fourth Coalition, who has defeated him, replace Napoleon with Louis XVIII again in a constitutional monarchy. And so what we have, if we want to run very briefly through this quick timeline of the French Revolution, and this is worth thinking about and trying to order in our heads. It starts with the Estates General, called because the king, Louis XVI, has no money. They meet, they can't agree on things, the National Assembly is formed by the tennis court oath, they demand a new constitution. At this time, panic sweeps Paris and the rest of the country. You have the storming of the Bastille and the Great Fear. Then, things still aren't solved despite the National Assembly's grumbling and talking about things. So, you have the women march on Versailles because they don't have food. And it is at this point that the king and queen are kind of held hostage in Paris, and a constitutional monarchy is formed. And that works for a little while, until Louis XVI tries to sneak away. Then he is executed, and that ushers in this new era of the Republic, where some reforms are made. The Republic is followed quickly by the Committee of Public Safety and Maximilien Robespierre, under whom the Reign of Terror happens. That is then followed by this Directory, this five-man oligarchy, which rules France for a very short amount of time before Napoleon seizes power in a coup, and leads as emperor before he is defeated after his Russian failure. Then Louis XVIII comes in real quick, rules for a little bit, not good enough. Napoleon returns in grand style for the 100 Days. He's destroyed at the Battle of Waterloo and sent to shame on St. Helena. And at this point, we have the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy with Louis XVIII. So by the end of the French Revolution, we've gone from an absolute monarch to a constitutional monarch. And along the way, we have a lot of death.